In today's video, we examine the most horrific police officer deaths ever recorded, from an officer directing traffic when a hijacked fuel tanker suddenly emerges at high speed, to an officer confronting suspects on a 7-story rooftop near a ledge, ending the altercation horrifically. It was August 29, 2016. The intersection at Avenida Caracas in Bogota's Norte Centro district sat beneath a hazy afternoon sky, diesel fumes mixing with street vendor smoke. Officer Mateo Ramirez, 32, stood in the center of 4 lanes directing traffic around a growing protest. Mateo had served for 8 years, working patrol assignments across northern Bogota. He'd built a reputation as reliable and calm under pressure, often volunteering for traffic control during the capital's frequent demonstrations. His sister described him as the kind of officer who followed protocol, even when others cut corners. That morning, he'd been assigned to manage the intersection, where a bus corridor merged with private traffic, a congested choke point during protests. His partner had been redirected 2 blocks away, leaving Mateo alone at the intersection. He lived in the Suba district and commuted daily on his department-issued motorcycle, always arriving 30 minutes early for his shift. Friends said he took pride in his uniform, pressing it himself each morning. The protest assignment was routine for him, something he'd managed dozens of times without incident. Bogota's bus rapid transit system moves over 2.4 million passengers daily through dedicated lanes that run through the city's busiest corridors, creating complex traffic patterns. By 2:10 in the afternoon, roughly 150 demonstrators had blocked lanes near the bus corridor. Mateo directed vehicles away from the intersection, while riot units staged several blocks away. Riot units were routed along a parallel artery and could not reach the scene because side streets were blocked by buses and barricades, delaying backup. Multiple stalled buses partially blocked his view of southbound traffic, creating blind spots where approaching vehicles remained hidden until they were dangerously close. Witnesses later reported hearing a large diesel engine accelerating unusually fast, but the noise of the crowd masked the warning. A fuel tanker that had been taken roughly an hour earlier on the city's South Ring Road by armed hijackers who diverted it through side streets to avoid checkpoints suddenly emerged from behind the stopped buses approximately 50 feet from the intersection. A fruit vendor standing beside his cart watched Mateo step into the lane, raising his arm to halt traffic. The officer turned his head at the last moment as the truck came through the red light. The front grille struck him squarely in the torso at full speed. The impact threw him backward and under the bumper. The tanker's heavy axle, carrying many thousands of pounds, passed over his lower body. Mateo's uniform shirt tore away as the tanker's undercarriage caught his body. Witnesses said the truck did not slow. It dragged him roughly 130 feet along the asphalt, his body grinding against the pavement beneath the chassis. A bus driver witnessing from his windshield later described seeing Mateo's body being pulled down the street, leaving a visible trail on the roadway. Protesters began screaming and scattering. Motorcycles and cars swerved violently away from the intersection. When the tanker finally swerved around stalled traffic and continued northbound, Mateo remained in the lane. His lower body had sustained catastrophic crushing trauma. Multiple witnesses stated his legs and pelvis appeared severely crushed. A protester called emergency services within 20 seconds. 2 nearby officers reached the scene roughly 2 minutes later. Ambulance crews arrived minutes later, but paramedics pronounced Mateo dead on the pavement. The medical examiner's report listed massive internal hemorrhaging, multiple pelvic fractures, and bilateral femoral artery rupture as cause of death. Police intercepted the tanker several miles away after it crashed into parked vehicles. Investigators later charged the hijackers with homicide and vehicle theft. The incident received brief local coverage, largely overshadowed by the protest violence that day. It was November 17, 2015. The Brightmoor neighborhood of Detroit sat cold and still in the pre-dawn darkness, a place where abandoned homes outnumbered occupied ones and where routine warrant service could turn deadly in an instant. Officer Maya Kowalski, 38, stood on the cracked sidewalk outside a dilapidated single-story house, flashlight in hand. Maya has been a police officer for 11 years, earning a reputation for steady professionalism during high-risk warrant operations. Before joining the academy, she'd spent 3 years as a corrections officer, work that taught her patience and threat assessment. Her personnel file showed dozens of successful warrant executions, most involving narcotic suspects or violent offenders. That morning, Maya and her partner were executing an arrest warrant warrant for a violent burglary suspect believed to be hiding inside the residence. Intelligence suggested the suspect was alone and possibly armed. The operation followed the patrol unit's standard knock-and-announce approach for warrant service. Knock-and-announce entry with Maya at the front door, her partner providing cover 6 feet behind, and 2 additional patrol officers positioned around the perimeter to watch the rear and side exits. The house showed no signs of activity, curtains drawn, lights off, the kind of quiet that could mean compliance or ambush. Officers arrived at 6:40 in the morning. The November air hung heavy with moisture, temperature hovering around 34 degrees. Maya approached the wooden front door, her partner maintaining position behind her, with weapon drawn. Standard knock-and-announce procedure requires officers to identify themselves loudly before forced entry, giving occupants time to surrender peacefully. Maya raised her metal flashlight to knock against the doorframe after announcing themselves toward the closed door. An improvised explosive device detonated instantly upon contact. The booby-trap device had been rigged to detonate when the frame vibrated, unleashing a concentrated blast that blew the door outward with devastating force. The explosion shattered the front window, scattering debris across the yard in a radius of 20 feet. Maya's partner later reported she was thrown backward an estimated 8 feet, landing hard on the frozen grass. The blast caused catastrophic injuries to Maya's right arm and shoulder, throwing her backward onto the concrete walkway. Wooden shrapnel from the door frame became projectiles, one piece nearly 8 inches long penetrating the front of her throat. Her partner said she remained conscious immediately after the explosion, attempting to push herself upright with her remaining arm as nearby officers moved toward her position. Severe bleeding came from both the shoulder injury and the wound to her throat. Her partner observed her pressing her left hand against her neck while making gasping sounds as officers attempted to reach her through the scattered debris. Another officer approaching from the side of the house reported Maya remained conscious but unable to speak, her breathing becoming increasingly labored as officers tried to reach her. She made several choking sounds while lying on her back, her left hand still pressed against the wound. Her partner said she maintained consciousness for approximately 2 minutes before her breathing slowed and stopped. Blood loss from the catastrophic arm injury and penetrating neck trauma made survival impossible, even with immediate medical intervention. EMS units arrived 7 minutes later. Paramedics attempted resuscitation but pronounced Maya dead at the scene. Bomb technicians confirmed the suspect had wired an improvised explosive device to a simple contact trigger attached to the door frame. The suspect was arrested hours later after a brief standoff in a neighboring basement and was later charged with murder and use of an explosive device. It was March 12, 2017. Alexandra Township in Johannesburg stretched across dense blocks of corrugated metal shacks and narrow dirt alleys, a place where officers from a police service responded to violent domestic calls nearly every night, and backup could be blocks away when seconds mattered. Themba Sotho, 29, had joined the police service 3 years earlier after working security at a shopping center in the Sandton district. He was assigned to Alexandra, where officers handled everything from petty theft to assaults in compounds where visibility dropped to nothing between buildings. Co-workers described him as reliable but occasionally impulsive, the kind of officer who would respond to emergency calls without waiting for backup if the situation sounded urgent. That particular Monday night, they said that Sotho had been patrolling the eastern section of the township. He had handled 2 minor calls earlier in his shift and was driving back toward the station when dispatch radioed him at 9:15 in the evening. A violent argument had been reported at a residential compound near 7th Avenue, with neighbors hearing shouting and the sound of breaking objects. Dispatch added that the call was classified as a disturbance with unknown weapons reported. The closest backup units were tied up with another incident several blocks away, and Sotho was the nearest available officer. Witnesses saw him arrive alone 4 minutes later, parking his patrol vehicle at the entrance to a narrow courtyard surrounded by sheet metal walls and small residential structures. He radioed dispatch confirming his location and that he was entering the courtyard to investigate. Residents in Alexandra Township often shared communal spaces between buildings barely 6 feet apart, creating blind corners and dead-end passages where ambushes could happen in seconds. Several neighbors stood near their doorways watching as Sotho walked into the courtyard. his flashlight sweeping slowly across the dirt ground while he scanned the corners between structures for movement. As he stepped between two structures, 4 men emerged from a gap behind a corrugated metal wall less than 8 feet away. Witnesses later told investigators the men carried machetes, heavy-bladed tools commonly used for clearing brush and demolition work in the township. Sotho reached for his sidearm, but was struck immediately in the right arm by the first blade, the impact knocking his hand away from his holster. A woman watching from a second-floor window across the alley saw the men close in around him in a tight circle. The first machete cut deep into his left shoulder, the force spinning him sideways. The second attacker swung downward into his back between the shoulder blades, the blade slicing through a seam in his uniform and beneath the edge of his soft body armor, which offered little resistance to a heavy blade. Sotho collapsed onto the dirt as the attackers continued striking him from multiple angles. The woman later estimated roughly 12 separate blows before she turned away. She told investigators afterward that the number was only an approximation because the attack happened so quickly. Several strikes opened deep wounds across his chest and upper abdomen, blood pooling rapidly in the dirt beneath him. One attacker pulled his vest upward and delivered another downward chop that caused massive abdominal trauma. The attack lasted less than 60 seconds before the men ran down the alley and disappeared into the surrounding township. The witness called police immediately. 2 patrol vehicles arrived within 5 minutes, finding Sotho unresponsive in the courtyard. Emergency medical services had been dispatched at the same time as the officers and arrived about 8 minutes after the first patrol units, but could only confirm death. The medical examiner determined the cause of death as massive hemorrhage from multiple penetrating wounds to the torso and extremities. 3 suspects were arrested within 4 days, following community tips, and later charged with murder and armed assault. Local newspapers covered the case briefly before moving on to other township violence. Sotho's funeral drew over 50 officers from across Johannesburg. It was July 21, 2018. The humidity hung thick over Manila's Tondo district as darkness settled across the cramped alleyways, concealing dangers that would claim a veteran officer's life in the most unexpected way possible. Rodrigo Cano, a 41-year-old officer with the Municipal Police District, had spent nearly 15 years working in Manila's most dangerous neighborhoods. He wasn't decorated or famous, just a reliable presence in anti-drug operations that had intensified dramatically over the previous 2 years. His wife had grown accustomed to the late-night calls and unpredictable schedules that came with plainclothes narcotics work. That evening's operation targeted a suspected dealer operating from a narrow 2-story concrete house wedged between similar structures in a densely packed residential block. The tactical team had deliberately chosen plainclothes entry without helmets or visible protective gear, hoping to approach the residence without alerting occupants who routinely posted lookouts. Supervisors had discussed the risks earlier in the briefing and emphasized speed and surprise over visible equipment because the alleyways were tightly packed and residents often warned suspects when uniformed officers appeared. Rodrigo had participated in dozens of similar raids, always emphasizing speed and surprise over heavy equipment in these tight, urban environments. The alleyway measured barely 8 feet wide, flanked by concrete walls scarred with decades of tropical weather and urban decay. At 10:40 in the evening, 7 officers entered the alley and surrounded the structure while residents watched from darkened windows. Rodrigo began climbing the exterior concrete staircase, a common architectural feature in Manila's older neighborhoods, where external staircases provide direct second-floor access. The stairs were steep and narrow, forcing him to lean forward slightly as he ascended. Another officer followed just 2 steps behind, covering the approach. The suspect appeared suddenly at the top of the staircase, silhouetted against the dim interior light. He was holding a concrete hollow block, the standard 6 by 8 by 16-inch construction material found on virtually every Philippine building site, weighing roughly 25 pounds. Before anyone could react, he leaned over the metal railing and released it. The block fell roughly 10 feet, spinning slightly as it dropped. It struck Rodrigo directly on the top of his head while he was leaning forward to check the doorway. The officer behind him later testified that the impact produced a dull, heavy thud. The force drove Rodrigo's head forward violently as he staggered on the narrow staircase. Rodrigo immediately sat down on the step as if his legs had simply stopped functioning. Blood began running down the left side of his face, dark against his skin in the dim light. His arms hung loosely at his sides, fingers twitching slightly. Within seconds, he slumped sideways onto the stairs, his body going completely limp. His eyes remained partially open but unfocused. The team radioed for medical assistance immediately, while 2 officers rushed up the stairs. They carried him down the narrow staircase to street level, his head rolling unnaturally. Officers attempted CPR while holding the alleyway and waiting for emergency responders. Emergency responders arrived approximately 6 minutes after the call, navigating the tight alleyways with difficulty. Paramedics checked for vital signs but found no pulse or respiratory effort. A later autopsy concluded the impact caused a depressed skull fracture with rapid fatal intracranial hemorrhage, and investigators determined death likely occurred very quickly, within minutes of the impact. The suspect fled through a roof access point, but was apprehended 3 blocks away attempting to blend into late-night street traffic and was later charged with murder. The concrete block was recovered as evidence from the staircase. Rodrigo left behind a wife and 2 teenage daughters. It was February 2nd, 2014. The Englewood neighborhood, Chicago, Illinois, United States, sat frozen under a bitter winter night, its streets empty except for patrol cars cutting through the darkness. This is where Officer Darius Whitaker would respond to a routine welfare check in the evening. Darius was 36 years old, a Marine Corps veteran who had served 2 deployments in Iraq before joining the police department 7 years earlier. He worked the midnight patrol shift in the 7th District, one of the city's most challenging assignments. His service record showed over 200 welfare checks completed without incident. That night, the district was short 2 patrol units due to sick calls, leaving several sectors temporarily covered by single officers until backup could be reassigned. Darius had built his career on careful judgment. He'd earned commendations for de-escalation and was studying for the sergeant's exam. His wife was 8 months pregnant with their 2nd child. He planned to transfer to a daytime administrative position after the baby arrived, trading street patrol for desk work and predictable hours. At 11:32 in the evening, multiple residents called 911 reporting disturbing noises from a basement apartment on a residential block. Callers described shouting and a strong odor consistent with propane gas seeping from the building's foundation. One neighbor reported hearing what sounded like metal being dragged across concrete. Another mentioned seeing unusual activity in the basement windows earlier that day. Dispatch entered the call as a welfare check with a possible gas hazard and noted that fire crews were being notified while patrol units responded. Darius arrived at 11:47 in the evening and knocked on the basement door repeatedly. No one answered. He could hear movement below the ground level entrance. The odor of gas had intensified, strong enough that neighboring residents had evacuated to the sidewalk. Darius radioed dispatch requesting another unit and fire response before attempting contact again, when a woman in the adjacent building called down that she'd heard screaming from inside moments earlier, and another neighbor shouted that a child's voice had just cried for help from the basement. Darius made the decision to force entry, responding to what sounded like an immediate emergency. The basement door gave way after 2 shoulder strikes. As it swung open, a sustained jet of burning propane erupted from the darkness less than 10 feet away. The resident inside had constructed an improvised propane jet device using a standard 20-pound tank, fitted with a hand valve and a short metal pipe nozzle, with an open ignition flame positioned at the tip. When Darius entered, the suspect triggered the device deliberately. The pressurized flame struck Darius directly in the chest. Propane flames can reach temperatures above 3,500 degrees Fahrenheit under normal conditions, and the jet ignited his uniform instantly. Fire spread across his tactical vest, duty belt, and radio equipment within seconds. The synthetic materials in his gear melted against his skin. A neighbor watching from an upper window later testified that flames completely filled the doorway. She heard Darius screaming for approximately 40 seconds before the sound stopped. Another patrol unit already working the adjacent block arrived roughly 2 minutes after the forced entry and found the doorway engulfed in flames. The officer immediately confirmed the fire response and requested additional backup. Fire crews arrived about 4 minutes after the emergency call was broadcast to the fire department. They extinguished the blaze and found Darius collapsed just inside the threshold. Paramedics pronounced him dead at the scene at 12:04 in the morning. The medical examiner determined death resulted from full-thickness burns covering 85% of his body, with extensive thermal damage to his respiratory system from inhaling superheated gases. Fire investigators documented that Darius's equipment had partially melted from the sustained heat exposure. The suspect was taken into custody after a brief standoff and later charged with first-degree murder. It was May 9th, 2013. The afternoon sun beat down on Marseille's Quartier de la Busserine, where 7-story housing blocks cast long shadows across cracked pavement. Officer Patrice Moulin, responding to a rooftop disturbance call, stepped through a metal door onto the rooftop to investigate the disturbance. Patrice, 44 years old, had served with the municipal police force for 18 years. His assignment to the northern districts wasn't glamorous work, mostly noise complaints, theft reports, and occasional vandalism. He'd grown up in Marseille's working-class neighborhoods and understood the tensions that simmered in the housing projects. His experience had taught him patience, but also caution when dealing with cornered suspects. That afternoon shift started routinely. Dispatch sent Patrice and his partner to investigate reports of individuals throwing objects from a rooftop onto parked cars below. Residents had called in complaints about loud shouting and debris raining down from the 7th floor of a concrete apartment tower. The building was typical of the district's architecture, aging post-war concrete construction with narrow stairwells and flat roofs bordered by a parapet wall, rising only 24 inches below modern recommended guardrail heights of roughly 3.3 feet in France. Patrice's partner stayed at the stairwell to secure the exit and radio for backup. The access hatch allowed only one person at a time. Municipal police in France handle lower-level disturbances, operating with limited protective equipment compared to national police units. Officers typically wear standard uniforms and carry basic defensive tools, but did not carry body cameras in this district at the time. Patrice and his partner arrived at 2:15 in the afternoon, parking their patrol vehicle in the courtyard below. Patrice climbed 7 flights of worn concrete steps to access the roof. When Patrice pushed through the roof access door, he immediately spotted 2 individuals near the western edge and radioed it. The roof stretched roughly 60 feet across, its surface covered in tar paper and scattered debris. The courtyard was open, and a woman hanging laundry on a 4th-floor balcony faced the western roofline directly, giving her a clear line of sight. The woman said that the confrontation happened fast. As Patrice approached, identifying himself and ordering them away from the edge, both suspects moved toward him aggressively. One suspect grabbed Patrice's uniform while the other shoved him from behind. Patrice stumbled backward, his boots scraping the tar paper as he tried regaining balance. His left hand caught the low parapet momentarily, but his momentum carried him over. His body struck the roof of a delivery van parked below. The metal buckled with a sharp crunch before he hit the pavement. The fall lasted approximately 2 seconds. The impact shattered the back of his skull. Blood pooled beneath him as residents screamed from their windows. The balcony witness called emergency services immediately, her voice shaking as she described what she'd seen. Patrol officers stationed 3 blocks away reached the courtyard within 3 minutes, finding Patrice unresponsive. Paramedics arrived 6 minutes after the initial call. Emergency crews pronounced extensive blunt force trauma incompatible with life. Later, the medical examiner logged over 30 separate fractures throughout his body: skull, ribs, pelvis, and limbs, along with massive internal bleeding. 2 suspects were arrested that evening after multiple witnesses identified them fleeing the building. Prosecutors later charged them with homicide for pushing Patrice from the rooftop. The rooftop where he fell remained a crime scene for 3 days. Thanks for watching. If you liked these stories, click here.